Since we have a pro-prisoner bent on this show, um, what kind of intersections do you see between incarceration and worker cooperativism?
So I'm sure there are people who can speak much more to the existence of co-ops among incarcerated people, but I do know that there are some, and I think it's a really exciting possibility. Both the idea of co-ops within prisons, right, that like prison labor is incredibly exploitative, and if one of the goals of worker co-ops is to create a better economic condition for the people doing the work and more control for the people doing the work, I think there's a lot of potential for co-ops, but also co-ops that are operating both within prisons and outside of prisons can create opportunities for employment for people who are being released from prison, which we know is a huge issue. But I think outside of like prison-based co-ops, there's also just worker co-ops in general have a lot of ability to support formerly incarcerated people, right? That like they're locally owned and worker controlled businesses. So there's not like a corporate policy that says everyone needs a background check, and if you have a felony, you can't work here. Worker co-ops can make their own rules and can decide like, we are not going to care about people's history of incarceration. We're not going to look at it. We're not going to think about it. They can decide we're going to proactively try to employ people who've been formerly incarcerated because those are people who need jobs, and we have the capacity to provide employment. I think also sort of going back to the peer networking piece, co-ops are a place where people can learn a lot of skills. And so I think co-ops can be used both to like create employment for formerly incarcerated people, but also can be used, so that can be a permanent thing, right? Like you come into the co-op and like, that's the rest of your life, but it can also be a stepping stone of like, you gain a bunch of skills, you build an employment history, which we know that lots of employers want to see your employment history, and then can work somewhere else if you decide that you don't want to stay at that co-op, or you can start your own co-op. I think that's another big potential, is like starting a business is not something that most of us are encouraged to do, but certainly a lot of people who've been incarcerated are not encouraged to do that. But a co-op is a way to do that that doesn't require like just one person, right? It requires multiple people. So you automatically have more skill sets, more access to resources, more opportunity for success. So I think there's a lot of possibilities. I think to me, like a really important first step is to really be encouraging worker co-ops to proactively look to people who've been incarcerated to offer positions, especially if there are like, I think something that becomes complicated is that depending on the co-op and depending on the sector that they're in, there are sometimes barriers, right? That like, I know that some of the home care co-ops have struggled because you need certain certifications, and those are state certifications, and the state has limits on who can become certified. But in areas where there aren't those kinds of certifications, like I think there's a lot of co-ops that could really proactively work with, especially with like, at least in Madison, there's organizations that are working with people who have been recently incarcerated, and trying to help them find employment. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for co-ops to work with those kinds of community organizations to like say like, yeah, our co-op is totally open to people who've been incarcerated recently. You know, here's what we're looking for. We're looking for like, are you willing to show up? Are you willing to engage? Are you willing to learn things? Like those are the things we're looking for. We're not looking at like, what have you done in the past that may be something that other places look at and say, oh, you can't work here. So that's something that I would love to encourage more co-ops to do, is really think about how they can be like provide employment to people who struggle to find employment, whether that's people who've been incarcerated or a whole lot of other people too.
Yeah,
a lot of overlap in all the different categories of people who have struggles with employment, right? There's like incarceration, there's mental health, there's like homelessness, there's like a lot of things that overlap. So sometimes it's hard to like tease out like what the actual piece is. But
yeah, in Chicago, there Well, I'll just say in general, even people who are innocent of charges that were, are innocent of convictions, have a hard time getting over that. Like right now in Chicago, there are people who were tortured under under Burge,
Mhm.
and a lot of them are still in prison. Like it doesn't matter that the government recognizes that they were tortured to confess to a crime that they didn't commit.
Mhm.
um, they're still living with the consequences. These opportunities to create work for people who are formerly incarcerated are really important.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm talking to some people who are incarcerated, and the example like Chai Fresh Kitchen in Chicago, I think is something that people should know about. Um, and yeah, Chai Fresh Kitchen. These are people who are formerly incarcerated. Uh, the majority of the workers, I believe, are formerly incarcerated, if not all of them. And maybe if no one in Madison knows about that, maybe that might, get some people interested to learn about that. And it seems they're very successful. Last year or the year before, within a year of them starting, they already purchased a building. They started at something called the Hatchery in Chicago, and after maybe about a year, they were so successful that they're able to purchase a building on the other side of town in South Side. And I went there for the groundbreaking ceremony. It's pretty exciting. uh Kind of, I was, while they're having the ceremony, I was explaining to neighbors on the street what it is, and there's like this genuine enthusiasm among people because
Mm.
it clicked. Like this isn't a regular business coming in. They're like, this is what our communities really need. They're really excited about this idea of like, oh, all the workers own the company, all the yeah. But one thing that comes to mind, that I'm wondering if something similar exists in Madison, if I'm sorry, in Wisconsin, uh, and if not, it's probably good homework for anybody over there. Um, there's this clinic in Chicago. It falls under the UIC John Marshall Law School, and it's called the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economic Clinic. And they informed me a few years ago that in the state of Illinois, that there's actually state law that people who are incarcerated can actually continue operating a business that they had prior to being incarcerated. This is at least in the state prisons. This is in the state prisons. I don't believe it applies to federal prisons or county. I don't know if it would affect the county incarceration at the county level. Uh, and that workers and people who are incarcerated can also start new businesses while behind bars.
Mm.
Um, the when I found out about this, I started asking people whom I write, like, hey, have you heard about this? And a few prisoners actually had, and but they were unable to make use of that. And they weren't thinking about this in cooperative frameworks, but they did try to make use of that. But the warden basically shot down all their requests.
Mm.
Anybody who had tried it, the wardens had shot down the request. And so I had communicated this to the clinic, and they're saying, well, maybe we just gotta like lobby or campaign or find some way to change who's in control of that decision of whether a person decides to form a business behind bars or continue a business behind bars. And there's nothing that suggests that these couldn't be worker cooperative businesses.
Mhm.
And I suspect though that one of the big things is the government doesn't want its monopoly challenge, or these different monopolies in these different industries where the workers are basically working for free. Yeah, they don't want that stuff challenged, but it has to be challenged, in my opinion. Whether the prisons are going to exist tomorrow or not, I think it's really important for people to have access to their labor on closer and closer to their own terms. But yeah, if y'all make any headway, if it turns out there's similar laws in Wisconsin or wherever, whoever's listening about this, and anybody makes headway, I think let us know. We all are, I think, very curious to see how like we can develop worker co-ops behind bars, because they're definitely going to help people who, you know, after they get out, you know, if they can have these businesses already set up and they can continue working on the outside, it's going to reduce recidivism. And the way I see it, you know, because some people are behind bars not because they harm peaceful society. The way I see it, some people are behind bars because they didn't have a community to defend them from the government or from predatory elements of society. And developing those relationships, I think, makes people stronger and more immune to any sort of predation, or I'm sorry, predatory behavior that sometimes oftentimes I think is what gets people in prisons, that just vulnerable people who didn't have anybody help them out. Yeah, that's my spiel on that.
Yeah, that's cool. I didn't know that that kind of law existed, and I'll have to figure out if we have something like that here. But that definitely seems like it opens up, like you're saying, like a lot of possibility, but then also there's sort of like the gatekeeping aspect of wardens. And so I feel like there's always that question of like, how do we change a system that we want to be gone? But in the meantime, like, how do we change it to at least be a system that doesn't rely on like perpetuating itself, right? That like right now, there's a lot of incentive to put people back in prison. Again, because of the labor, you know, like it's right, like it makes sense as a warden, right? Like, why would you want people to like have their own business that they could leave and not come back and work for free? And I don't know how to change that piece, but yeah, that's a really interesting law though, because that would really open up a lot of possibilities for people, especially to be able to have meaningful employment, like sort of already set up. Because I think that's another big thing, like what you were talking about, Chris, about like community support, is that like co-ops aren't just, for the most part, co-ops aren't just like another job, right? Like you do have support built in, partially because you own it together. And so you kind of need to provide support to each other because, you know, if something happens to one person, it affects everyone else. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of possibility there. But yeah, changing that part of the system is hard, for sure.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to think about, because like the energy that you put into maybe lobbying or something, what would happen if you put that energy into other places? You know, could you get a lot of people out sooner? It's hard. I mean, a lot of the prisoner support that I see, I don't see any like mass release happening anytime soon. There was an opportunity during the pandemic, some saw it for like Illinois, but nobody really worked on it. So in the meantime, these types of reforms, they might be very meaningful. So
I mean, I would love to say that like we won't have a prison system at some point, but it's really hard to imagine having no prison system. So the more we can do to make it something that is like temporary and like not something that like follows people for the rest of their lives seems like an important step, right? That like even if we do have incarceration, like making it something that's like, yes, this thing happened, you do this thing, and then you have a life beyond that where you have support and community and economic opportunity, and not just like a endless cycle of being forced back into incarceration for like minor infractions of overly strict parole restrictions and stuff like that.
Yeah, reduce the footprint.